are listening to Regeneration Rising, a podcast from Quivira Coalition's new agrarian program that provides information and inspiration to agrarians beginning their journey in regenerative agriculture. Each episode will explore what it means to work in regenerative agriculture, how people come to choose this as their livelihood, and why it's important to them and our future. We hope this podcast provides a foundation of knowledge for future agrarians and land stewards so they can rise up and focus on a regenerative approach to community, relationships, and the land.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Regeneration Rising. I'm Taylor Muglia, and my guest today is Will Vogl. He is the owner-operator of Vogl Homestead Farm near Colorado Springs, Colorado. Will and I have such a good conversation on the podcast today about what it's like to start an operation on a place like the Front Range in Colorado, where land prices are really high and development pressure is also very high. I think Will has such an incredible way of viewing those things as an opportunity. And it sounds like this has evolved over time, but he has a really sustainable structure that works for his life that integrates agriculture, but also provides him an income. And he can also make time for his family because Will is also a firefighter with 2 kids and a wife running a custom sheep grazing operation. So I really enjoyed our conversation. I think it is such a cool concept for other young people to follow. And so thank you so much for tuning in today, and I hope you enjoy. Will, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me come on.
Let's just start with a little bit about yourself. Where are you from? What brought you to agriculture?
I am born and raised here in Colorado Springs, Colorado. I grew up with my folks having a cattle ranch a little bit east of the Springs. And so up until 2000, I kind of had that experience being around the cattle and doing 4-H and all that. And then when we had the mega drought hit, I basically watched as a young teen their entire cattle operation fall apart, right? And when they were doing cattle, it was all pasture raised, but grain fed. So they were kind of doing what they thought at the time was, the most humane for raising animals, and then selling it all as wholes and halves and all that to direct to market. But yeah, they had to basically sell off everything. The property we raised them on basically didn't get any rain at all for a year. And we had nothing to feed them, and it was the same everywhere else. So at the same time, prices went up on hay. Everyone was destocking and they couldn't get much for their animals. So that was kind of the end of my early farm life. But I've always wanted to live on land. So I went to college, became a firefighter. I met my wife, and then we bought 7 acres not far from where I grew up, and just a little house. We had 1 kid. So at this time. So it was like the perfect starter home. At that point, I was like, yeah, let's try homesteading, and so started with a little garden, and I got some chickens, and then I got some more chickens, and I ended up having like 100 chickens at one point. I'm like, okay, I can actually maybe make this into a business. And about that same time, a coworker of mine was like, hey, have you heard of this guy that does these chicken tractors and he raises all these birds? His name's Joel Salatin. And so that kind of got my entrance into regenerative agriculture that way. Looked into him, was hooked right away. And then for like the next 4 years, I basically it was like having a college degree of just self-taught regenerative agricultural practices from all these different people. And fast forward a few years, the chickens were going good and whatnot. And then we got some sheep, and then, like a lot of us, we all get overworked. So I had to drop the chickens because the sheep are really what I enjoy raising the most. But we still have a little bit of a market garden operation where we do mostly perennial crops and then a few long season annuals and whatnot. And if I get overworked, I can kind of neglect that a little bit, and it's not a big deal. And then we've kind of started branching out with the sheep a lot into a couple different things. We raise them for meat. They're a hair sheep breed, white Dorpers and St. Croix cross. We live in an area along the Front Range that it's considered the foothills still. So we're still high elevation. We're over 7,000 feet here, but we're not in the mountains, and it's ponderosa forest. So, and it's at most places it's pretty dense. This area was kind of the area that built the Front Range as far as lumber production back in the day. And then it regrew after we removed all the elements that controlled the forest naturally. And it's just kind of regrown into this wild mess of a forest. And it's become a huge fire hazard for people and whatnot. So we started running the sheep, not just in some of the more prairie areas, but these forested areas, and kind of using them as a understory restoration tool, because when we mob graze them through these areas, it's mimicking what would have happened several hundred years ago with the herds of, elk and deer and everything in the hundreds of thousands migrating through and kind of trampling up everything, eating trees, keeping them thinned out and all that. And we see the understory start to kind of come back after a few years because they're, breaking down that pine needle duff that gets too thick for things to grow through. We're starting to thin out trees, let more sunlight in, and kind of revert it back to more of it's kind of more designed to be like a savanna type forest instead of this lodgepole pine, thick, dense forest that a lot of people see it as. So
yeah, and that's the Black Forest, as far as I
Yep.
understand, right outside of Colorado Springs.
Yeah, and it's there's a area called Black Forest, but the forest itself actually ranges about 40 something miles from the foothills of the mountains all the way out into the Great Plains, and it kind of follows this divide that's called the Palmer Divide, which is basically a divide between the Platte River system and the Arkansas River systems. So it's kind of a north-south divide instead of the typical east-west ones you hear about. So
yeah, it's funny. When I moved to Colorado, I kind of just didn't really think about all of the smaller watersheds and different elevation changes, even on the Front Range, because it feels like the big one is just the Rockies, right? You've got the plains that are kind of lower, and then you just shoot up into the Rockies. But on the Front Range itself, you have quite a different topography. I mean, that's pretty crazy. You guys are at 7,000, close to 7,000 feet.
Yeah, our house is at 7,200 feet.
Wow, for the Front Range.
Properties we lease that are upwards of 7,500.
Wow.
I think the lowest is about 6,800.
Okay. So kind of rare for the Front Range. And yeah, tell me more about the history of the ponderosa here. Because I went and visited one time to that area, and I was like, whoa, this is really weird. There's like nothing but ponderosa. I didn't see a single other species, I think, the whole time.
Yeah, and it's a kind of a unique forest in that sense. It's one of the few forests or trees that kind of grows naturally in a type of monoculture as a tree species. Now, it's designed or normally in a healthy ecosystem, you'll get a very healthy understory of fruit bushes and grasses and forbs and all that. Where we see a lot more thinned out trees, we'll generally see currants and chokecherries and mountain mahogany and all these other bush species that kind of come in and are native to this area. But yeah, you don't see a lot of areas that are intermixed with a lot of other trees. On occasion, sometimes you'll see them with Doug fir or some Rocky Mountain junipers and stuff. But generally speaking, it's kind of a monoculture tree. And it's funny because you look at the history of this region, and the settler journals that you can find describe this area as park-like when they first came here. They were kind of in awe, and there was these pine trees that were 5 foot in diameter and stuff that we don't see today at all. And because of its easy access versus pulling trees out of the mountains, this became the lumber center for everything from Pueblo all the way up into Denver in the 1800s. So they basically logged all the good stuff out of it and all the mature ponderosa trees. And then somewhere near the end of the 1800s, there was a big fire. I imagine, I haven't been able to find much on it, but there's a lot of slash and leftover stuff that they left behind. And at that same time, a lot of settlers were coming here. We were putting up fences. We'd already killed off a lot of the wildlife in mass, So what grew back from that was this thicket of trees that normally would get thinned out by either low intensity ground fires, which ponderosas are extremely fire resistant for that, or it would be these huge herds of animals that would come through and have a similar effect on the landscape as a wildfire would. And once we removed all that, people started moving here. At this point, it was called the Pineries. It wasn't called Black Forest actually until after World War II, where we had all these veterans coming back from Europe, and the thickness of it at this point was similar enough to the Black Forest in Germany that they started nicknaming it that.
Oh, no way. That's crazy. Okay.
Looking at the history of the forest, it's interesting because most of the trees here now are only about 130 years old or so, maybe 140. Most of the older ones were cut out or burned down, long ago. So This is really just what has come back is forest that was basically unmanaged for the whole time. And now, we had one of the biggest fires in Colorado here about 11 years ago. And it's intense how different it is and how unhealthy it is in a lot of ways. So I try to take the knowledge sets I've learned from just the way this forest is, and a healthy environment, plus my full-time job as a firefighter, I learned all this stuff on mitigation and stuff, and trying to put those two knowledge sets together into one. So
Cool. Well, thanks for giving us that context. Yeah, and you're in a part of the Front Range that is pretty rapidly developing. That's also something that I noticed quite remarkably in that part of the state. I would love to talk to you today about sort of the aspect of your operation that includes leasing. And so, yeah, why does leasing, so you say you have like a home property, but why does leasing in particular smaller parcels make sense in your area?
we're within about an hour of pretty much 40% of Colorado's entire population. We're about 20 minutes from Colorado Springs. We're an hour or so from downtown Denver. So this area has become a big place for a lot of people that don't want to live in the denser areas of town. I kind of call it a rural suburban area, where what they do is they take these big properties and they cut them up into 5-acre lots, and then they put houses on them and stuff. So you'll get these neighborhoods similar to a suburban neighborhood, but it's just on a way spread out scale. And so you end up with a lot of properties that are anywhere from 5 to 40 acres. And they're all, pretty much well fed. They all have septics. They're not connected to anything outside of maybe natural gas and electric. And it's, kind of got those rural elements, but also it's still close enough to everything that people want to move here. And so with all the boom that's happened over the last, 10 or so years in the market, land prices have gone incredibly high. So to back it up a little bit, we're on 7 acres, right? Which for our dry environment isn't enough to really raise much of anything, right? So I recognized real fast that we needed to get access to more land. And so buying land was pretty much off the table. It was the land prices we see today, still after everything's kind of cooled off a little bit, even, is anywhere from $14,000 to $60,000 an acre. And that $14,000 is like when you're buying hundreds and hundreds of acres. So it still ends up being a multi-million-dollar property. And so, there's no way to recoup a investment in that through farming, right? It's almost all priced for development. And then you get a lot of people that move from either out of state in these areas like Chicago, LA, Houston, whatever. And they come into this area where they can sell their house for even more, get some property and a bigger house than they had before. And, they're a lot of times able to pay in cash and whatnot. So we saw these prices just go through the roof to a point where it's just not feasible. So the flip side of that, I've noticed real quick, is we have a lot of people that come out here to have space. They want to be a little further away from their neighbors, but a lot of them don't necessarily want to have animals. So a lot of people will move out here, and then after a year or two, they'll realize, they're like, oh, I got a lot of land I got to manage. The way it started for me was I started leasing a property up the road from us that was agricultural in nature. And then they ended up selling that property, and I had to kind of scramble to find some more real fast because at this point I'd just gotten the sheep and whatnot, and I knew they were not going to do well on our 7 acres. I started reaching out to some of my neighbors that I knew didn't have anything on their land. And at this point, we started using a lot of the portable fencing and electric netting and stuff. So I was able to approach some of these properties that have even no fencing and be like, hey, you mind if I graze your property? And most of them were like, oh yeah, that'd be great. I don't have to mow it. Then I started finding other areas around us that, might be 5, 6, 7 miles away, doing 1 or 2 properties in a kind of close proximity. And then I noticed what would happen is after I'd graze one property, I'd have neighbors coming out, and like they all love watching the sheep and stuff. So they'd be like, hey, you want to come do mine too? And so I started kind of branching out into these little, I call them hubs of leased land, essentially. And now we're to a point where we lease about 250 acres of property right now. And every year I end up having more and more people kind of come out of the woodworks and be like, hey, I heard you're grazing over here and whatnot. Would you mind doing that for us? And it works well because I'll get enough properties all close together that I can literally just walk the flock property to property. I don't have to truck them usually. A lot of times I can take them through somebody's property. I'm not even leasing, and they're fine with that. And it works out well for the logistical components of it. And then on top of that, it's useful because a lot of these people, they just love watching the animals. So if they start seeing something that seems a little off, they'll let me know, even if I'm at work or doing something else somewhere else. So it's nice having those extra eyes. And then they all almost always have water and electricity. So it's super easy to get them, all the sheep, the stuff they need for being on those properties. And then oftentimes the predator loads a lot less on these properties too. We see the coyotes kind of stay away and whatnot a lot more. So for the smaller properties, I don't have to bring in our livestock guardian dogs like I do with some of the stuff that I have further out.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Yeah. I find that those, I mean, anywhere between, and we also talked about too, these properties are not desirable for most large scale livestock operations. It just doesn't make sense for them to come to do, 10 acres.
That was one of the things I noticed real fast was trying to find access to these larger properties was almost completely off the table. I mean, a lot of these properties, they've been leasing out to cattle guys or whatever for years and years and years. And so they have no desire to change who they're leasing to. Sheep are just a lot better, I think, at coming into these small acreages than like a big herd of cattle are anyway. So it's just way easier for me to bring them in and have them kind of do this stuff for people on their properties. And then unfortunately, it's a lot of education on my part, but a lot of people have this notion too that, the sheep are less destructive or something like that than cattle, which is a common myth. And, so it gives me an opportunity to educate people too, that it's, not the animals themselves, but it's how they're being managed. Because we have the other thing we have a lot around here is horse properties and stuff. So a lot of people associate cattle and horses with these basically 5-acre feedlots that people have created on their properties because they have 4 horses on a property that can't support it or whatever. So
yeah, I always find that it's like such a, in terms of land management, and I think we were just talking about this at Kivera actually, like the concept of the ranchette and splitting this land up into just this like inconveniently sized parcel, because in the West, 5 acres is not super helpful if you're going to, like, you can't run a full farm. You can't even, in some cases, like, you don't want just one horse, so then you get 2 horses. And then managing that land on 5 acres is quite cumbersome, and that grass runs out quickly if you don't have irrigation. And so, yeah,
absolutely.
it just sets up people for failure,
Yeah, especially here in the West, it's just every year is so different too with the rainfall we get and whatnot. We average normally about 18 inches here, and which is higher than most places around us. But like last year, we had almost double that because of how wet it was. And then I've had years where we might get 10 inches.
Yeah, so, exactly.
And you can see these little properties, especially in those dry years, really suffer, because they're not being managed in a way that a normal ranching operation would, because, people don't want to destock their animals. A lot of the times they're pets. So unfortunately, the land suffers at that. So, but there's enough people that move out of the city in these more populated areas out here too, that they just want somewhere for their dog to run around and whatnot. And that's almost as bad in some senses too, as the opposite side, because all they have is maybe a couple deer come through a year, but it's not getting the animal impact on that land that it needs and whatnot.
Yeah. Yeah. I know this like double-edged thing. It's like, it sounds like a cool idea, and it's nice to have the space and the quiet and escape from the city. But in terms of a land management perspective, like, oh my gosh, what a disaster. You got certain places are dirt lots. Next door is a jungle. The next one's a dirt lot. And it's just, I think, do you ever like drive by these small parcels and you're just like, oh, just knock the fences or create little gates between them. You just want to create like a whole corridor.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. Well, and so there's one of our kind of main hubs now is this. It's a dead end street, but it's got about 35-acre properties on it, and they're all perfectly the same rectangle size for the most part. And a lot of times I ended up getting these properties next to each other, and that's exactly what I'm thinking. I'm like, God, it'd just be so much easier if we could go through this fence right here.
Totally.
Or whatever,
Totally. And just line them up. And I don't know, my vision, I'm actually super curious to talk about some more logistics of this, but I just think it would be so cool to create a sense of like shared stewardship and shared like a project. Like we're all trying to steward, even though there's a fence here, this is the same land, and we're all just responsible for a little chunk of it.
Well, and that's what I tell people with the wildfire side too, is, you can have one person mitigate their property perfectly. And it sucks when you got to tell them that's great, but it might not matter because your neighbors haven't done anything. And, if we get a wildfire that's coming through the canopy of that forest, your mitigation is like, almost for naught. You need, hundreds of acres mitigated before it actually caused that fire to drop to the ground and get to a point where it isn't destroying everything. And, it sucks for people and it discourages them a lot of the time. So it's nice that I'm kind of able to come in these areas and actually start working with multiple property owners all in the same area. And even if there's gaps between those properties, it's enough at that point that you can start making a difference over the long term.
You said you did have an ag lease previously. Are there any properties where you're like, you don't have to deal with the landowner? You kind of can, maybe it's a larger property that you can kind of count on each year?
For the most part, it's 1 to 5 years is most of my leases, right? And the way it often goes is I'll come in for a year, do 1 year lease with a lot of people. And especially for these smaller properties where they just want the animals to come through. They don't want necessarily a lot of work or other stuff done. Almost all of them people live on, right? So I'll work with them every single year to just renew a lease. And then a lot of times some of these will turn, especially the kind of 15 to 40 acre size, I'll come through for a year. They love what I'm doing. And I'm like, hey, you have all this stuff I could do, especially through NRCS grants or whatever. But I'm not going to be able to do that in a 1 year time frame. It's going to require at least 5 years, if not longer. And so a lot of the times you'll have these property owners that they really just want the property for the property. They don't want to have it for anything else. So they'll let me basically do almost whatever I want, as long as I keep them in the loop and it's not going to, cost them an arm and a leg. That's where we can really start affecting a lot more changes. But I'm also finding that some of these 1 year leases too, they'll see me doing work on other properties and they'll be like, hey, if I just paid you to come mitigate and cut down some of these trees, would you do that? So it kind of works itself out to a degree as well. People are always curious what their neighbors are doing.
So it sounds like word of mouth is sort of the best way of getting these new leases, but are there any other methods of finding property? And then also I'd love to just go into how you've crafted or what resources you use to craft good leases.
For the most part, it's word of mouth. There's been a few times where going back winter before this one, we had a particularly snowy winter and my sheep got stuck on one property that just, it was hard to get in there. I was having to feed them hay because I couldn't move my whole setup at all. It was encased in ice, essentially. I did put out a call through some local Facebook groups and whatnot, just be like, hey, I'm looking for something a little further out where I know it doesn't snow as bad or the snow melts off a lot better, just as backup. And that worked out really well too. And then next door seems to be a great resource for the same stuff, especially for stuff that's closer. But for the most part, it's people see me running my sheep through multiple properties and they'll start talking to their neighbors.
Yeah. And then the agreements that you put together, was there anybody that helped you craft that, or did you just kind of go based on pretty common sense?
I went kind of a mix of what makes sense of what people want. And then, honestly, the original idea of doing this came from Greg Judy's book
Cool.
about leasing land and whatnot. So I kind of took his template a little bit out of his book and then modified it to what makes sense. And for the most part, most of our leases it's a single page of just removes liability from them, from me being on the property or if my sheep get out or whatever. So they don't have to worry about that. And then on the flip side, I want to make sure my sheep are not having problems too from property owners being neglectful. So if they're not watching their dogs or somebody turns off my fence on purpose, or if they run an ATV through a fence line and don't tell me or something like that, and my sheep get out and somebody gets hurt, that's going to be something that they know that I'll be expecting some kind of compensation from. But for the most part, most people are older and are kind of hands off. So the simple lease works well. I've had a few where it becomes longer, especially with the longer terms, where you got to explain the grant processes of if I'm applying for a grant, the funding's going to me because I'm doing all the work and all that stuff. Or if they want specific things added in there about water or whatever it is, I kind of cater that as best as I can to that as well. And yeah, for the most part, it's pretty straightforward and common sense.
Cool.
It's nothing too crazy. And if I have somebody that wants to come at me with a 7-page lease, then it's probably going to be a no.
Yeah, there's
So
enough land out there, it sounds like.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so who pays who? I've heard couple different people, yeah, develop different models, and I've also heard about a bunch of people just doing, canceled it out. You got your lawn mowed, and I got forage, and we'll call it good. So, what's your approach to that?
So if we're just doing a straight grazing lease, especially 1 year, then it is just let me have water and electricity and I'll mow your lawn. If they want me to do more like cut down trees or whatnot, then they'll have to pay me for that stuff for my time and labor. But most of my leases go under that. They don't cost anything. I've had a few specifically. We had a hay pasture for a year where I paid a little bit, but it was bottom land, really good stuff. And they weren't going to hay it that year. So, and it was a sizable enough property. It made sense for me to do something like that. But I won't pay for anything on the small side just because it gets into the logistics of I have 20 different property owners that I see as a landlord, essentially. It's a little burdensome to keep track of all that. So just having it tit for tat makes it really easy as far as tracking all that. But on the flip side, we're also getting out of these hubs as well into areas that I don't have other properties or whatnot. So it doesn't make sense for me to just graze it because of the time it takes me to get the animals there and then remove them, set up the fence, all that. That takes quite a bit of time when you're only going to be there for 2 days. So we've started also kind of developing more into a business too of having property management services with our sheep. So similar to what you see people do with goats, we'll bring them in for per acre charge to either mitigate weeds, mow, if they want the understory of a forested area cleared out, we can do that. And then if they want something more, like I always offer, if they have an area they want more of a dramatic improvement on, then they can pay for the hay that I can bring in and do some bale grazing on certain areas too, and kind of restore the soil. And especially if they want something closer to the house. We're talking to one person that they want that done over their new leach field that was put in 2 years ago, and there's a lot of open ground still on it. So they're hoping that helps, really spur on a lot more grass growth on there. So
yeah, that brings me to my next question, which I worked a little bit with doing custom sheep grazing, and yeah, it did kind of turn into just property management overall because I think too there's like this impression of what it's going to look like after an assumption actually like what it's going to look like after the sheep leave, and it wasn't the perfect flat green countryside that they thought it was going to be. So we actually ended up having to run mowers after the sheep to just try to keep the landowner happy. And then it was like, okay, well, yeah, this is turning into something different altogether. So have you had to do that, do weed whacking or mowing on those pastures?
no, and I explain that straight up in front. A
Okay.
lot of people do have that assumption that
Yeah.
it's like the days of old where the
Yeah.
sheep are mowing the White House lawn
Yeah,
and
exactly.
whatever.
Yeah.
And you're like, no,
No.
it's not like that.
No.
There's sticks and twigs and
And it should be
stems
like that.
standing up.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I explained to him too, I'm not in the business of just mowing to mow. The way I'm doing it is meant towards land restoration. That's everything we want. And I might push it a little bit to make a person happy, but up front, I'm going to explain to them, hey, this is what sheep do. This is what you can expect at the end. It might not look pretty right away, but you give it a few months of regrowth and it always looks way better than it did before. A lot of people, they understand that basic concept. And then when they're looking at either having somebody come field mow or have animals there to do it, and the price is pretty close to the same, then that's up to them. If they want a perfectly manicured lawn, there's people out around here that do that with a tractor and whatnot. But if they have less care and they like having the enjoyment of having the animals there and they don't have to take care of them and it's all going to go towards improving their soil in the long run and they can go with us. So
Yeah. And that's also something that I've always wondered about the logistics of balancing all these operations. It might be different based on you guys are a little different elevation than we are, but on the Front Range, it's where we have pretty much brome dominated pastures. And what happens is that since it's pretty monoculture, we don't have a whole lot of other grasses doing their thing. So it's like you hit one property, it's like perfect prime time. Everybody calls you. They say, "Oh, grass is huge. Like come over right now." And you obviously can't. You got to choose what the sequence is going to be. And then all of a sudden it's, August, everything's kind of crispy. And then you've got people that potentially never even got grazed. and it's kind of already gone to seed. And so how do you time that? Seems like you want all the sheep all at once and then none of the sheep.
Oh, I know. The way I've kind of worked it now, and this is largely so I have forage through the drier and dormant times of the year, but we're kind of working towards more of a model where June and July is where I'm really hitting people that want to pay. That's going to be the prime months for that, obviously. And that's where you see a lot of people around here too, especially in some of these ritzy neighborhoods where they have a strict HOA where they're required to have their 5 acres mowed or something like that within a certain time frame every year. So I'll try to hit those during that time of the year, unless there's a specific property that I'm leasing already that I also want to have a certain effect on. But generally speaking, because we get a lot of those same grasses, it's the bromes and the crested wheat
Crested wheat, yeah.
And we get a couple of varieties of warm seasons like blue grandma and whatnot, but for the most part it's those cool seasons here, and that's when they're just going nuts. And then in the forested areas it doesn't matter as much. The primary thing I see outside of the brome usually grows along the edges of the forest where there's more sunlight, but once you get into the deeper areas it's almost always elk's edge, which is a really short grass, and they graze through it really fast anyway. What will happen a lot is a lot of these properties that I'm grazing, I'm doing it in August, September, and I'm going through 5 acres with 40 sheep in 2 days just because they're going through it so fast and whatnot. And so a lot of it's still keeping that momentum going, and it works well with my work schedule where usually I'll do 3-day moves, and a lot of the times I might get 2 of those on a 5-acre property before I got to go to the next one. And generally speaking, they just want it mowed once anyway, so it kind of works out that way. But the sheep also eat a lot of the same stuff that goats do. So even when things go to seed, we're seeing them eat those seeds and breaking them down, so they're not a problem too. So for the most part, I mean, it started off obviously their favorite forbs, but they're getting to a point now where I see them eat the seed pods off of mullein, and I'm seeing them eat thistle like it's grass almost now. And the other one we get a lot around here is knapweed. And as long as it hasn't gone brown, they'll eat that too. So we can kind of time that as well, which given our elevation is usually a little later than a lot of lower elevations see for the seed production and whatnot. So
I mean, I guess it depends on the year too. The year I started running sheep was this terrible, it was like 2020, 2021. There was one year in there where it was like I was tossing hay in August because it was like so bad. The forage quality was so bad. It was so dry that like everything just burned up by July.
I say that's a unique thing about where we're at is because of our elevation here, and we're in El Paso County, so for the most part, which is the most populated county in Colorado, right? But it's also one that has notoriously bad water rights for any sort of irrigation. So essentially, there's almost no irrigation rights anywhere in our county. There's a few, if you get way on the far east side where it's Great Plains and stuff, and it's all well fed. But for the most part, we don't have access to irrigation at all. So everything I've done is based around grazing this just dry land pasture and forest understory, ultimately. And every year we do it, I've noticed the sheep adjust more and more to what we have. And it's not just like I was saying with the weeds, when we first started, they wouldn't touch mullein, and now I'm seeing them specifically start to target it after they've eaten their favorite stuff. And then they teach their babies that, because we try to keep, especially the ewe lambs, we try to keep them on as long as possible, and we'll make the moms wean them themselves. So they're getting the full education from mom that they're eating, and then they gain a little more and they pass that on. And so every year we just see it improve more and more, and they adjust to this climate even better. Even if we get a drier year, wet year, whatever, they seem to acclimate to that. So
this is a topic I don't know much about, but I'm sort of gathering. I'm just wondering, agricultural tax status. Do people approach you and say, hey, can you, run your sheep? And then perhaps they could get agricultural tax status and have a different sort of tax liability. Have you dealt with that much?
I've worked a little bit with it so far. As of right now, nobody's actually gone for it. And part of that's our county specifically is kind of, they don't view agriculture as a primary function of our area anymore. Unless you're on the very far eastern side of our county. They came out 4 years ago with a new master plan, and basically everything around us got rezoned as residential. And so many property owners have tried to go back to that ag status, and the county just straight up won't let them. I have told every property owner, especially the larger ones, they usually won't do it for the small 5-acre properties, but for the 35 and above acreage, that's where kind of ag status still can be obtained. And oftentimes, since we have this lease, they have something that shows this is a legit farm that's using our land as an annual part of their operation. And if I needed to write something else and explain it, better, I'm more than happy to help our homeowners do that. I think that's going to be something that's going to be very county or state specific, depending on where somebody's at, though, because there's other counties like Elbert County here, which is right next to us. They have no problem doing that. You can go in and walk out with ag status with a little bit of paperwork and whatnot for the most part. And it's so different, even just going a couple miles from where we're at. As far as like, if people want to do that, I think they have to look more into their local county government and whatnot, because ours is very much developer dominated. And you can tell that everything they do now, I mean, we've had them come down on us for other like farm projects with our garden and stuff because they don't understand it. And they're like, no, this is supposed to be like residential stuff. And I'm like, no, I'm making it work. And I'm sorry I don't fit into your box, but I don't have to. So
Yeah, that's so tricky. Yeah, I'm always curious about that because it felt like if you could possibly get them the tax benefits of having an agricultural property, perhaps you could charge them a bit of that to maybe make it worth your while to bring animals. So
I know here, at least, it's about a $4,000 process to go into the county and have them change that status back. So, obviously that's going to be on the homeowner or the property
for
owner
sure, yeah,
to make that decision and whatnot. But which is why it generally doesn't make sense anyway for a smaller property. But if somebody's got 40 acres and we can prove that we're doing that, and something else that we got one property I'm starting to do this with just as a forest health thing where they have a ton of mistletoe trees that need to get cut out. So we bought a sawmill and we're getting ready to set it up this year. That's going to be part timber, which is also an ag process as well. So they'll have a very good argument to go into and be like, hey, change this back because this is a legit thing, not just somebody grazing a few animals, but it's almost a full farm operation now.
Wow, that's super interesting. Yeah, tell us a little bit about any other enterprises that you've fell into. I'm sure as a firefighter, they're like, hey, could you come do this? Like, could you go do that?
We started off as doing this for meat. That was the big thing, right? And then doing the land management side of it for profit was kind of something that came along out of enough interest being there and people wanting that to happen, but it just logistically doesn't make sense for me to just do it for free. And then some of these properties, like I said, we could look at doing mitigation on. I think it helps because we have a part-timer that we usually hire in the summer. And halfway through the summer is usually when I start having issues keeping him busy. That gives me something else to do as if I need more on my plate anyway. But it gives us a profitable something to do where I can have my helpers essentially be full-time through the summer and keep them paid well. And then we're getting ready to get into this every year. So I was mentioning how we have those little trees that grow in these thickets of just hundreds of them. And the sheep will eat those if I bring them through there. They eat the pine needles off, and then usually those little baby trees can't handle it and they die off. But if there's areas where property owners are okay with us digging those up, what I'll do is I'll go in there, and I call them shovel trees because you can dig them up with a shovel. And we'll transport them with doubled up grocery bags. And then I'll charge people that live out of the trees, per tree, doing a kind of a wholesale thing where we'll transplant 25, 30, 50 trees or whatever and plant them for them. And then that way we're taking this resource out of the forest that needs to be thinned out really badly. If I leave it, the sheep eat it and it has no value. Or I can turn that into a profitable thing. And that's actually one of the most profitable things we do now is doing tree transplanting every spring. And
wow.
And technically we can do it in the fall too, but the land gets so dry.
Right, digging those out.
It breaks me down physically to do that. It requires more equipment than I have. Whereas in the spring, everything's soft. I can do everything with shovels and whatnot. So we typically do that May through part of June. And then once it gets too hot, the trees don't transplant as well. That's when we call it quits. And every year it's a little different. Last year we went way later into June than I've ever done because it was just way cooler than normal. And then other years it's like the first week of June, we're hitting 80s and 90s. And I'm like, yeah, that's it. That works out really well. A lot of the time property owners just want us to thin them, but we always offer property owners a per tree amount of that because it's a resource off their property. And most of them they just want the holes refilled and that's it.
Yeah, well, as you're talking, I'm like, holy crap, how is this guy a firefighter and doing all this stuff? What does your schedule look like most of the season?
It's very busy.
Yeah.
Because on top of that, then I have 2 boys as well. So I'm also doing the dad thing too. And in the summertime, it's nice because that's obviously the busiest time for most farmers and ranchers anyway. And once they're out of school, they can come out and help me, and it gets them out of the house and away from the screen. And they generally like that quite a bit. And then my work schedule it's nice enough where we have 24-hour shifts. So we'll do a couple of those in a row, and then I'll have several days off. And even though I work that more per week than an average job is, it ends up leaving me more daytime hours to have off anyway, because that's also while they're sleeping. And so it meshes well with doing the farming thing. And basically I've designed it so that when I'm moving animals, it's based around that schedule of moving them every 3 days. It works out really well. I know a lot of people talk about doing those daily moves or whatever in the summertime, but you got to do what makes the most sense and not burn yourself out, and I've definitely been there to that point too, where you do way too much. When I started out, I was way overly ambitious, and we're doing meat birds and eggs and the market garden and sheep. And I was like, this is not working. And especially because this is obviously my passion, but it's definitely not my wife's passion. She helps when she needs to, but I try not to burden her with all the work that needs to be done all the time. And so it's required me to be a lot more efficient with my time when I am off and working on things and whatnot. And then making sure a lot of it is hands off. And I mean, our whole breeding program is based around what is going to save me time. Obviously, if you need help lambing or whatnot, they got to go. But also, if I notice hoof issues or they're not shedding off well and they need sheared and stuff, those are all things that are time commitments that need to go. It just has made me better at that stuff overall, making sure that I only have to check them every 3 days.
In my experience, I was the same way. I was like, every 24 hours, no matter what, like I am committed to this principle. And then I don't know, a couple of years in, I was like, I'll just put a big paddock up and see what happens. And I wonder what the difference is between if you're still moving them every 3 days. I mean, I don't know, but I would bet that the difference is not as big as we think it is.
Well, and I've noticed it depends on what time of the year too.
Totally.
Obviously in the winter time when the ground's frozen here, I actually go to much bigger paddocks. I might not move them for a month because the ground's dormant. They're not really over grazing it. I still want them to have a cover on the ground. I don't want them to eat it to the soil, but you got enough snow cover here that's not an issue so much. And then once the ground starts actually thawing, then I can move them again. But I try to give myself a little more of a break in the wintertime anyway, just because of that. And then I'll do the same thing if we have a vacation we want to go on or something like that. I make sure that they might have a full 10 acres on the most lush pasture I have or whatever. And that way they have several weeks of forage if they need it. And I can pre-set up hay or whatever if I need to and whatnot. And we make that happen. And then I make it so that maybe I have a neighbor or, property owner just kind of check their water and top it off for me. And if I need something more, we have a couple of people that I can turn to if I need them to check on it during lambing or whatever.
Well, that's good to hear. Whatever will make you more likely to continue the work into the future is the most important.
You see it all the time. I mean, I've seen several operations around us that were doing phenomenal work, doing very similar stuff to us, but they just burnt themselves out. And, I know a lot of people have this philosophy of like, if they're going to go into it, they need to quit their job and like make it so they can't go back. And I feel like that's a recipe for a lot of people to end up burning themselves out because they don't have any sort of cushion at all if something happens. Whereas I have this full-time job that allows me to kind of cater our operation to what makes the most sense instead of trying to make it as profitable as I need it to be to actually have a working income. And that takes a lot off my plate, not having to worry about that. And then it allows me to build it up because at some point I do want this to be my full-time job as a rancher. I want this to be kind of my retirement gig. And so it allows me to kind of work towards that in baby steps instead of just trying to jump off a bridge and do it. So
I love that. I think that's great. I'm kind of in the same camp too. I just feel like it's not necessarily about squeezing all of this energy into this short period of time. I would rather see people stretching it out over the course of a decade or two into a career, whether that means getting a part-time job, getting a full-time job, something that will let you do it for longer, seems to me.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, and I mean, I think the other big piece is making sure that whatever farming enterprise you're doing is what you really enjoy doing.
Mhm.
You know, there's things I liked doing, but when it became a task, then it loses all of its joy. So like washing eggs or whatever, that was one of the suckiest things I had to like rely on every single day. So that's why that was one of the first things to go was our egg laying operation. We made sure to kind of figure out what that balance is with the work life. And it's really become for me just kind of my daily therapy, essentially. You know, it's what I really enjoy. I get to be out in the forest and listening to happy animals eat. And that way I'm not stressed for time and whatnot. So I'll usually give myself, even though we run 2 different flocks because we don't band our rams, I always try to balance that out. So I'm not doing a big project with both flocks on the same day or whatever. I'll make sure that if I'm doing a big move with one flock, I'm not doing a big move with the other. And that way you're not just beating yourself into the ground too.
This was fantastic. I'm curious. We kind of touched on a little bit of this, but do you have any advice for other people who are getting into this industry, perhaps apprentices in our program, or just folks that are looking to transition into agriculture?
Yeah. So I imagine a lot of places are seeing the similar thing with development and land prices being just absurdly high for any sort of production value. And I don't think this is just for dry areas, but I imagine you go to other places of the US and it's the same, or even other countries, even, I don't know. But I think this is a good way to start off looking at buying your own little home site, even like we did, or just finding something for rent and stuff, and then making those connections. Because that's really what it took. If I had just moved out here, I would have had a lot harder time doing that. But building those connections with people around the community and whatnot while you're doing other stuff with a kind of an eye on the future of, I know I want to do this, but maybe 5 years out from now. And that's really where I've started to see the biggest benefits, because some of the other things I forgot to mention this earlier is we'll do like snow plowing in the wintertime. And so a lot of times I'll have people that I've grazed their property. They're like, hey, you're doing snow plowing too, right? You can come out and do that or whatever. And you start noticing these little connections everywhere. And then you start going into those connections where people know each other that you didn't know before. And it's kind of funny because you start building more of a community that way. And once you do that, I mean, I've noticed a lot of these leases just kind of fall into place that way. And at some point, I don't know where the peak of what's plausible for how many of these small acreages I can have. You know, there is a management side to that where I have to manage all these little leases and whatnot and update them every year and all that. So I guess the downside to that is there's probably a upper limit on that, just reasonably speaking for workload, but it's high enough for sure that somebody could get started and kind of get their operation going and then look to the future of maybe finding that larger property that can actually be their centerpiece of their farm at some point. And I know I'm still hoping on that because we still have a few large properties around us that you kind of get the classic, you know, owners they're getting into their 80s or 90s and they definitely don't want to farm it anymore. And a lot of their kids aren't farming. So maybe we can even help some of those property owners have a longer term vision for their farm down the road that's not selling it to a developer or whatnot. So I've noticed every year we keep doing this, I keep meeting more and more people. And eventually I imagine we'll find a connection to one of these operations that might be in that point and just giving them a different avenue instead of going straight to having their farm get chopped up into little properties. And
yeah, absolutely. Well, where can people find your farm? Do you have social media? This is a good chance to share that if you'd like.
I don't have a website yet. Everything, even though we sell direct to market, it's always been very direct to market, you know. It's, you know, reaching out on Facebook and stuff to people. So the only real connection I have is our Facebook page, which is the Vogl Homestead. On there, I kind of treat it like my blog posts and whatnot. So where I go into a lot of the educational pieces of what we're doing. And then not very active on it, but we do have a TikTok too under the same name.
Right on. Well, cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And yeah, best of luck with this season.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for tuning in. If you'd like to connect to the broader Quivira community of ranchers, farmers, conservation and government agency professionals, educators, nature nerds, curious consumers, and more, we're excited to have you. Our website is quiviracoalition.org, and in the upper right, click on Get E-News to sign up for our newsletter, where we share happenings and events, learning opportunities, job postings, and more. Also, if you're enjoying this podcast, please leave us a review and a rating. It really will help other people find us and maybe even find their next step in regenerative agriculture. Thanks so much, and see you next time.
This podcast was produced by Quivira Coalition in our quest to support resilience on working lands. Learn more about our work and how you can support regenerative agriculture and solutions to climate change at quiviracoalition.org. This episode was edited and engineered by Caleb Wenzel-Fisher. A Folk Story, our theme music, was made by Alex Cristoforetti, and we're grateful for our guests who take time out of their busy lives to share their experiences with us.